On June 1st, 2001, the chief executive officer of the most powerful software company on Earth sat down for a newspaper interview and said 6 words that would follow him for the rest of his career. Linux is a cancer. That was Steve Ballmer, the CEO of Microsoft, speaking to the Chicago Sun-Times. Not some off-the-cuff remark in a hallway, a deliberate, public-on-the-record statement from the man running the company that controlled more than 90% of the world's desktop computers. He called the operating system that today powers his own company's most important product line a cancer that attaches itself in an intellectual property sense to everything it touches. And here is what nobody expected. 25 years later, Microsoft cannot turn on its most profitable business without the very thing its leader called a disease. Not figuratively, literally. More than 60% of the computing power inside Microsoft's Azure cloud runs Linux. The cancer became the cure, and the story of how that happened involves a billion-dollar proxy war, a complete corporate reversal, and a question that still has no settled answer, a question I will get to later in this video, about whether Microsoft's embrace of Linux is genuine or whether it is the most sophisticated version of an old and dangerous playbook. Let me give you the number that matters most, because it tells you everything about where this story ends up. As of 2024, according to Microsoft's own disclosures, more than 60% of customer compute cores on Azure run Linux workloads, not Windows Server. Linux. That means on the cloud platform that Microsoft built, that Microsoft sells, that Microsoft names after itself. The majority of the actual work being done is running on the operating system its former CEO called a cancer. And Azure is not a side project. In the most recent quarter reported, Microsoft's Intelligent Cloud segment, the division that houses Azure, generated $34.7 billion in revenue. That is nearly as large as the company's entire productivity division, which includes Office and LinkedIn. Azure revenue grew 40% year over year. It is, by any honest measure, the engine keeping Microsoft at the center of the technology industry. Now hold those numbers in your mind. Because Steve Ballmer did not just insult Linux in an interview and move on. Microsoft, under his leadership, spent years and millions of dollars actively trying to destroy it. And the way they did it was not through better products. It was through the courts. But that part of the story, the secret funding, the proxy lawsuit, the billion-dollar legal assault, requires some context. And the context starts with what Ballmer actually believed he was fighting. To understand why Ballmer used the word cancer, you need to understand what Microsoft was in 2001. It was the most dominant software company in history. Windows ran on virtually every personal computer sold. Office had no real competitor. The internet was still young enough that Microsoft believed it could control access to it, which is exactly what the Department of Justice had just finished suing them over. Linux, by contrast, was an upstart. A free operating system built by volunteers, shared openly, improved collaboratively. It was governed by a license called the GNU General Public License, or GPL, which said that if you used open source code in your product, you had to share your modifications under the same terms. Ballmer's argument, and this is what he told the Sun-Times, was that the GPL was a trap. He claimed that the way the license is written, if you use any open source software, you have to make the rest of your software open source. Legal experts at the time noted his interpretation was overstated. The GPL does not work that way. It applies to derivative works, not to every piece of software a company makes. But Ballmer either misunderstood the license or chose to misrepresent it. Because for Microsoft in 2001, the conclusion was the same either way. Linux threatened the business model. If companies could get a reliable server operating system for free, why would they keep paying Microsoft for Windows Server licenses? And so began a campaign. Microsoft did not just criticize Linux publicly, it funded a legal war against it. In 2003, a struggling company called the SEO Group filed a lawsuit against IBM. SEO claimed that IBM had improperly contributed SEO's proprietary Unix code to the Linux kernel. The lawsuit demanded first $1 billion, then $3 billion, then $5 billion in damages. It threatened every company using Linux with potential legal liability. And Microsoft's role in this was not subtle. Microsoft paid SCO millions of dollars in what it publicly described as licensing fees. But critics, the Linux community, and later court proceedings revealed a more strategic picture. Microsoft was helping to fund a legal proxy war designed to create fear, uncertainty, and doubt around Linux at the exact moment it was gaining traction in enterprise data centers. The lawsuit dragged on for years, and what happened to it, what the courts actually found, connects directly to the reversal that was coming. But before I get to that, I need to tell you about the man who changed everything. On February the 4th, 2014, Microsoft's board of directors announced that Satya Nadella would replace Steve Ballmer as chief executive officer. Nadella had been running Microsoft's Cloud and Enterprise division. He understood something Ballmer never fully accepted, that the future of Microsoft was not Windows on every desk. It was Microsoft services running everywhere, on every platform, including platforms Microsoft did not control. His public signals came fast. Within months of taking the job, Nadella stood on a stage and displayed a slide that read, "Microsoft loves Linux." For anyone who had followed the previous decade of Microsoft's hostility toward open source, this was not incremental. It was a philosophical reversal. Nadella was not just softening the rhetoric, he was rewriting the company's identity, and he backed it with decisions, not just slogans. In 2016, Microsoft joined the Linux Foundation as a platinum member, the highest tier, costing $500,000 annually in dues. The Linux Foundation, the organization whose entire mission is to grow and protect the operating system Ballmer had called a cancer. Microsoft was now paying to support it, sitting on its board alongside Google, Intel, and IBM. In 2018, Microsoft bought GitHub for $7.5 billion in stock. GitHub was the world's largest code hosting platform, home to 28 million developers and 85 million repositories. It was the central infrastructure of open source development globally, including virtually all Linux kernel development. The company that had funded lawsuits against Linux now owned the platform where Linux was built. Meanwhile, the SCO lawsuit that Microsoft had helped finance collapsed. A federal magistrate struck down the majority of SCO's claims, noting that the company had produced virtually no proof that IBM had misappropriated any code. The judge compared SCO's legal strategy to a security guard accusing a shopper of theft and then demanding the shopper prove what was stolen. SCO's claims were ultimately dismissed. The company filed for bankruptcy. The billion-dollar assault on Linux ended not with a verdict, but with a whimper. And what emerged from the wreckage tells you something important about what came next. Because Microsoft did not just stop attacking Linux, it started depending on it. And how deeply it now depends on it is something most people, even in the technology industry, do not fully grasp. The dependence grew quietly at first, then accelerated until it became impossible to ignore. In 2019, Microsoft released Windows subsystem for Linux version 2. WSL2 did not emulate Linux. It shipped an actual Linux kernel, built and maintained by Microsoft, inside Windows. Let that settle for a moment. The company whose CEO had called Linux a cancer was now distributing a Linux kernel as a built-in feature of Windows, not as a third-party add-on, not buried in some developer preview, as a component of the operating system that ships on hundreds of millions of computers. Then came Azure Linux, Microsoft's own Linux distribution. Originally developed internally under the name CBL Mariner, it powers the containers behind Azure Kubernetes Service, Azure SQL, and Cosmos DB. LinkedIn, which Microsoft owns, migrated nearly all of its servers, virtual machines, and containers to Azure Linux. Databricks migrated more than 100,000 virtual machines and over 1 million CPU cores to it. In June 2026, Microsoft released Azure Linux 4.0 based on Fedora as a general-purpose distribution available to any Azure customer. Microsoft does not just use Linux. Microsoft now makes Linux. And this is where the story connects to something much larger than server operating systems. Because Microsoft did not just adopt Linux for technical reasons, it built an artificial intelligence business on top of it. GitHub Copilot, the AI coding assistant trained on code from GitHub repositories, generates revenue that flows through the intelligent cloud segment, the same segment powered by Linux on Azure. Microsoft's entire AI strategy, its partnership with OpenAI, its Copilot products embedded across Office and Windows, all of it runs on infrastructure that is majority Linux. The cancer Ballmer warned about in 2001 is now the foundation underneath Microsoft's most ambitious bet on the future. But there is a human dimension to this story that the business numbers do not capture, and it involves the very people whose work made all of this possible. In the early 2000s, if you were a systems administrator or a developer who chose Linux, you did so at professional risk. Microsoft's campaign was not just aimed at corporations. It filtered down to individual careers. Companies that feared SCO's legal threats pulled Linux deployments. Consultants reported clients ripping out entire Linux installations and replacing them with Windows because their legal teams could not guarantee that running Linux would not expose them to a lawsuit. CCO was demanding $1,399 per CPU as a licensing fee just to run Linux. For a small business or a startup, the uncertainty alone was enough to drive them back to Microsoft. The people who believed in Linux during that period, who contributed code, who advocated for it inside companies that were hostile to it, who built their careers around an operating system that the most powerful software company on earth was actively trying to kill, those people did not get an apology. There was no acknowledgement from Microsoft that the FUD campaigns were wrong. No recognition that the SCO funding was a calculated attack on a community of volunteers and small companies who were building something better. What they got instead was a corporate pivot that turned their life's work into Microsoft's competitive advantage. And now there is a new chapter. In late 2022, a group of open source developers filed a class action lawsuit against GitHub, Microsoft, and OpenAI. Their claim is that GitHub Copilot was trained on billions of lines of code from public repositories, code that was shared under open source licenses requiring attribution, copyright notices, and license terms when reused. The developers allege that Copilot strips away those legal requirements and outputs code without the attribution the licenses demand. The lawsuit is still working through the courts in 2026, with DMCA claims gaining particular traction. The central question is uncomfortable. Did Microsoft buy the platform where open source developers share their work, then use that work to train a commercial AI product without honoring the terms under which the code was shared? Whether the lawsuit succeeds or fails, the pattern is hard to ignore. The people who built what Microsoft now depends on are once again asking whether Microsoft is a genuine partner or something else entirely. And that brings us to the question this video has been building toward. There are two honest ways to read this story, and fairness demands you hear both. The optimistic case is that Microsoft genuinely changed. Satya Nadella is not Steve Ballmer. The company's contributions to open source are real and measurable. Microsoft is one of the largest contributors on GitHub. It open-sourced .NET Core, PowerShell, and Visual Studio Code. It ships a Linux kernel inside Windows. It maintains its own Linux distribution. It employs engineers who contribute directly to the Linux kernel. The argument is simple. Nadella recognized that the old model of proprietary lock-in was losing to the cloud, pivoted the company, and proved through sustained action over more than a decade that the change was authentic. Customers demanded Linux on Azure, and Microsoft met them where they were. That is not sinister. That is a company adapting to survive. The pessimistic case is that this is the most sophisticated execution of Microsoft's old playbook, embrace, extend, extinguish, ever attempted. That phrase is not a conspiracy theory. It was documented in the Department of Justice's antitrust trial against Microsoft in the late 1990s. Intel executive Stephen McGeady testified under oath that Microsoft Vice President Paul Maritz described the company's strategy using those exact words. The strategy means adopting an open standard, adding proprietary extensions until the Microsoft version becomes dominant, then using that dominance to eliminate competitors. Critics argue that GitHub is the embrace. Microsoft now controls the platform where open source code lives. Copilot is the extend, taking that code and building proprietary commercial products on top of it. And what comes next is the part that worries people. The truth is almost certainly somewhere between these two positions. Microsoft's embrace of Linux is driven by economic necessity as much as philosophical conversion. Azure cannot compete with Amazon Web Services without Linux support, because the majority of cloud workloads worldwide run on Linux. Microsoft did not choose to love Linux. The market required it. Whether that pragmatic adoption carries genuine respect for the open source community or merely uses it as raw material for commercial products is a question that the Copilot lawsuit and the next 5 years of Microsoft's behavior will answer more honestly than any corporate press release. What is not debatable is the irony. The company whose leader said Linux is a cancer now has a balance sheet that proves the opposite. Linux is not a cancer inside Microsoft. It is the bloodstream. June the 1st, 2001, Steve Ballmer sits down with the Chicago Sun-Times and delivers a verdict on the future. Linux, he says, is a cancer that attaches itself to everything it touches. He is certain he has the full weight of the most dominant software company in history behind him. And he is wrong. Not slightly wrong. Historically, definitively, measurably wrong. The cancer now generates $34.7 billion a quarter for the company he ran. It powers the servers. It runs the cloud. It ships inside the operating system. It trains the artificial intelligence. It is so deeply embedded in Microsoft's business that removing it is unthinkable. This is the second video in the Smart Investment Breakdown series on Microsoft's history with the technologies it once tried to destroy. The first covered how Microsoft helped kill Netscape and what happened after the browser wars. The next video in this series will cover a story that several of you asked about in the comments. Microsoft's war on open document formats, how it fought to keep governments locked into proprietary file types, and why that battle is still being fought today. If this story surprised you, that one is going to surprise you more. If you have watched this far, you understand something that most people in the technology industry still have not fully reckoned with, that the most powerful companies do not just compete with the future. Sometimes they try to destroy it, and sometimes the future wins anyway. If that is the kind of story you want to keep following, subscribe. Not because I am asking, but because this series is going to cover the full history of how the technology you use every day was shaped by decisions most people never heard about. And the next chapter is already written. I just need to show it to you.